Germans are always on time, they follow the rules, and they really love wearing white socks in sandals. These are the stereotypes people inside and outside of Germany laugh at. But is there some truth to it? And if so, to what extent? Is there a connection to our history, to war trauma? I've been wondering around this question. Is there a possibility to show the foils on the screen? Sorry. No. No worries. I was wondering about this question since my gap year in Australia. I'm a journalist, I'm a psychologist, and after high school I went to Australia. I was this super shy, stereotypical German girl, hardly ever looked someone into the eye. And in Australia was really like a cultural shock to me in a positive way. So people are always smiling, having a chat to strangers on the streets, in the supermarket. And I was working there after high school as an assistant in nursing in a psychiatric hospital. But before that, to earn some money, I was working as a waitress in a German restaurant called Lowenbrau. And I will never forget this one evening, me wearing this farmer's dirndl and high heels, carrying these big mugs of beer, falling over a chair, spilling the beer on another woman. And I was so in shock, constantly apologizing, being prepared to be yelled at. And all this woman did was smiling at me and saying, "No worries." And I was like, wow, I mean, imagining this happening here in Berlin, I don't know whether I'd still be here. So coming back to Germany was a bit tough. My mom still tells a story of me trying to just chat to a shop assistant who looked at me as if I was a bit weird. And ever since, I was wondering, why are we that way? Why do we make life so much harder? And why are we always finding a problem in every solution? Have you ever wondered why Germans can be so annoying sometimes? Please raise your hand if you did. Some of you did. So, me too. But to be honest, when I wanted to dive into the topic, the question, are these stereotypes actually true? And is there a connection to war trauma? I have to say, it's not that easy to say, because there are so many factors to it. So many factors influence cultural norms. And also, when you look at trauma, there's a big debate on what trauma actually is and what not. But then I was talking to a researcher, and he said to me, "Mel, maybe you shouldn't be too German about it." So this is why I'm here now, giving you my insights as an invitation to have a discussion on it, and maybe some inspiration for further research. So, thanks to the Turkish community, about 8 years ago, the Alman meme started, and it became really popular in the year 2019. Alman is the Turkish word for German, and the meme is a caricature of German behavior and cultural norms, focusing on traits like punctuality and following the rules. And about the same time, there was another meme. It said, "In Germany we don't say, we say," and it made the British influencer Liam Carpenter famous.
Bloody hell, the weather's horrible!
Wieso? Wir sind nicht aus Zucker.
Es gibt kein schlechtes Wetter, nur schlechte Kleidung.
So, how much truth lies in these stereotypes? What do you think? Are these stereotypes actually true? Do they really describe us as Germans? Raise your hand. Okay, that's only a few. Who thinks it does not describe yourself, but other Germans? Raise your hands. Okay, these are more. So, well, if you would ask a Karnevaljak in Cologne or tell them Germans don't have any kind of humor and they don't get irony, they would say, well, maybe you don't get the joke. Of course, people are very different in different areas, and stereotypes are always an exaggeration. But if you ask Liam Carpenter, he would say his memes are that successful because he always adds a truth to it. So today I want to focus on certain stereotypes. Of course, there are many of them, but let's start with the first one, and this is adherence to rules. Who of you thinks Germans like following rules? Please raise your hand. That's almost everybody. Wow.
Du fängst unten bei den Füßen an und dann arbeitest du dich langsam vor zum Herz, weil sonst gibt es einen Herzinfarkt. Ganz einfach. Hey! Nicht vom... Jetzt springt der vom Beckenrand. Anzeige ist raus, Freundchen.
So there is actually, you were pretty right, there is some truth to it. If we look at Gerd Hofstede's model of cultural dimensions. So this model compares countries from all over the world, and the data is quite recent, from 2023. And if you look at it, Germany ranks quite high, with 0.65, and this says that Germans try to minimize uncertainty through strict adherence to rules. If you look at the US, they only have a moderate ranking, so they are not as avoidant than the Germans. And there's also the World Value Survey that also supports the idea that Germans value security and predictability. Let's start with the next one, punctuality and orderliness. Who thinks this is true? German are punctual, always on time. Okay, this is the majority. I was wondering, because we have the Deutsche Bahn, and we know that among Europe, the Deutsche Bahn is one of the least punctual trains. But still, you're pretty right when it comes to the Germans.
Guten Morgen, Andrea, unser früher Vogel. Haben Sie mir für 15 Uhr den Konfi geblockt?
Na klar.
So lobe ich mir das. Gib mir 1 mit Stern und diesem Smiley-Stempel.
Genau.
Sehen wir später, Peter.
So we look at the next dimension of Hofstede, which is long-term orientation. And Germany also scores relatively high, which means that German culture values long-term commitment. We focus on future rewards, and that's why we also contribute to punctuality and orderliness. And you also might have heard of German angst, which is not having a fear of not driving a Porsche, but German angst is a real thing, and Germans report that they have social fears and concerns among the German population. So the fear of uncertainty can also drive a preference for order and predictability, which manifests in well-organized workplaces and a strong adherence to schedules and deadlines. Last one. Well.
Ich glaub, es geht schon wieder los. Das darf doch.
Okay, last one I have for you. Being negative and reserved. Who thinks this is true? Okay, I would say it's maybe a third of you who agrees. So, of course, if you're more anxious, you might be also a little bit on the negative side, and many of you are actually right. So, if we look, for example, well, let's first play this one.
Germans, we're not sociopaths, though, okay? We have emotions, we feel things, we just don't express emotions because it's very energy inefficient to show emotions, okay? It takes a lot of energy, right? So we Germans, we have emotions, we feel them, but then instead of expressing them, we take the energy to make better cars.
Okay, So, well, it can be said that Germans are actually quite satisfied with their life when we look at... No.
Okay, just... What is this? Give me a hug. Give me a hug, I need this. Come on, please, give me a hug, Nick. Please, just give me a hug. Ow!
So when we look at being satisfied with your life at the OECD Better Life Index, we can say, okay, Germans are actually quite satisfied, but there is something else which is true, and that is that Germans don't really express that much their positive emotions. So Germany is classified as a neutral culture, so where people are more likely to control their emotion in contrast to cultures, those like in Southern Europe or Latin America. And there is some research, as you can see, that when it comes to facial expressions, then the Americans tend to show more positive emotions and Germans show rather negative ones. And this was also seen for, or a big example for Walmart. I don't know whether you remember this case. So there was some cultural misalignment between Walmart's American business practices and their German customers, because the Walmart employees were always smiling, greeting, asking, how are you? And the Germans felt this was quite intrusive. So, but why is it this case? Why is it that Germans are this way? And have we ever been different? Indeed, the perception of Germans as serious is relatively recent stereotype shaped in the late 20th century. So obviously the World Wars have played a role. But before we dive deeper into the World Wars, we should also really consider that cultural norms are shaped by very, very different factors. For example, the educational system, which really is focusing on being precise. Religion, if you think of Protestantic birth ethics, the Industrial Revolution, and not to forget children's books. But of course, the World Wars also have played a big role, especially the immense losses of the World War II left deep scars on the national psyche. Not to forget the division of Germany and, people in Eastern Germany facing 40 years dictatorship on top. So what role does trauma play? This is actually not that easy to answer because the terminology of trauma is used differently by different disciplines. So if you would ask a historian or a sociologist, they would probably say, yeah, that plays a big role. But for example, in medicine or psychology, there are very strict definitions. So the word trauma is Greek and means wound, and the American Psychological Association says trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event like an accident, crime, national disaster, physical or emotional abuse. The psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk explains it is not just the event itself, but the individual's response to it that determines whether something becomes traumatic. So the same event can be traumatic to a person and not to another person, depending on the conditions and the resilience, for instance. Van der Kolk also says that trauma can be transmitted across generations. So it does not only impact the person who experienced a certain event, but also further generations. And the trauma can be transmitted by parenting styles. So traumatized parents might be overprotecting or emotionally cold. They also transmit habits and fears. Also important is cultural memory, so social narratives, for instance, and trauma can be passed on through epigenetics. Research indicates that trauma can lead to changes in gene expression, and that may be passed down to future generations. Regarding epigenetics, we know a lot about fruit flies and rats, not so much about humans. They're mainly correlation studies, but there is some evidence that Holocaust survivors, for instance, exhibit alterations in stress response genes. When it comes to the German population, there is not these kind of evidence, or we don't know much about this yet. And the research on intergenerational trauma focuses on traumas rooted in discrimination toward a minority group, like Holocaust survivors or the Black community, for a good reason. But to understand our society in a better way, we should also look at the trauma of perpetrators and to understand this better. So we don't have that much data on the offender, on the perpetrators, but there is a study from 2014 showing that indeed there is PTSD symptoms like flashbacks, nightmares, and severe anxiety in German war survivors, especially in women. And there, I also want to refer to Alexander and Margarete Mitscherlich, who in 1967, they argued that post-war German society struggled to fully mourn and process the trauma of Nazi era and the Holocaust. So they highly repressed their emotions of guilt and responsibility. There's also a study by Professor Heide Glesma, and that showed evidence of higher PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, prevalence rates among older age groups in the German population, which is assumed to be related to the consequences of the World War. And I also want to give you another example by Harald Welzer. So understanding the effect of war trauma on the intergenerational transmission is not that easy in the psychological field, but he interviewed 40 families, talking to them about the intergenerational transmission of trauma and the memory within German families in his book, Grandma Wasn't a Nazi. And he highlights the psychological impact of these transmitted memories. Children and grandchildren of those who lived through the Nazi era may experience inherited guilt, anxiety, and confusion about their national identity. And this also leads to another topic, and this is shame. Shame plays a very big role in this too. So Theodor Heuss, who was the first federal president of Germany, was demanding accountability by the Germans, which was so important. But he was also talking about collective shame. He said, nobody can take the shame away from us. And if we look at psychological studies, we know that guilt is good. It's a behavior you can change, but shame is really problematic because it refers to the person. And when it comes to the rehabilitation of offenders, this is what the behavioral scientists Thomas Albert and Maggie Schauer say. Then we know that a sense of guilt and acceptance of responsibility leads to a better prognosis than strong feelings of shame and humiliation, which is important to address. Research also suggests that shame can impair the ability to empathize with other people, and it can lead to social withdrawal. So this is why Maggie Schauer argues the feeling of collective shame is problematic. So, as you can see, there is some proof, there lies some truth in the stereotypes of Germans. Refined our cultural norms, partly in it, but not all of it. For example, if you think of work ethics. So Germans really don't work as much as other countries. And a friend of mine from Somalia, she always says Germany has a really good PR. Of course, our cultural norms are changing. And on the other hand, it is so important to look at our history and understand the history, because otherwise, what is the solution? If you travel, you will always meet Germans. And I really was wondering whether Germans are trying to escape Germany as often as possible. Maybe this is not the solution due to climate change, for instance, but maybe we can try to be more likable, try to be more relaxed. And there was a recent interview by Van der Kolk who said, actually, the German society is really changing. For instance, when we look at how people raise their children. So, and of course, we also know by psychology that it's important to not only address certain things individually, but also talk about them collectively. And maybe that's why these memes, thanks to the Turkish community, thanks to many, many people who came here to Germany, are so important to us to see a mirror of how we Germans are and how we can become better. Thank you so much for listening, and have a wonderful night at Republica.